Hello, everyone. Welcome. My name is Diana Ginsberg, and I am the CEO of Olam, and I am excited to welcome you to this webinar in which we are launching a piece of research we commissioned related to the Jewish and Israeli response to the humanitarian crisis in Ukraine and bordering countries. For those of you who are new to Olam, Olam is a network of 65 Jewish and Israeli organizations working in the fields of humanitarian aid, international development, and global service. We convene and mobilize Jewish leaders and organizations to take meaningful action in support of the world's most vulnerable people. Within days of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, it was clear to us that there was an unprecedented response within the Jewish community. At one point, 16 of Olam's partner organizations were in Ukraine and bordering countries. And many of our allies in the Jewish engagement sphere were also directly involved due to their presence in the region. In addition, due to some of the personal networks in which I am involved, I learned of some amazing Jewish-led grassroots efforts responding to this crisis. As a convener, one of Olam's roles is to collect field-wide data. And therefore, we commissioned Rostov Consulting to conduct this report as a means of educating the general Jewish public about the Jewish and Israeli response to this crisis, galvanizing increased Jewish philanthropic support to the long-term needs of this crisis, and sparking conversations related to future and other humanitarian crises worldwide. This report does not aim to be the final word on the Jewish humanitarian response to this crisis, and this crisis is still very much underway. But it does capture preliminary findings from the early stages of the crisis. It is also worth noting that the list of interviewees is by no means comprehensive. There were many amazing individuals and organizations impacted by and responding to this crisis that we could not simply cover in this report. We did opt for a diversity of organizations and individuals over depth within any particular organizational category. In many ways, as you'll hear shortly, Ukraine is unique in terms of its multiple Jewish connections, but we are hopeful that conversations around the crisis in Ukraine can open up a greater consciousness and compassion in the global Jewish community about the needs of all refugees and other humanitarian crises around the world. We will share a link to the report in this chat, and you are welcome to download it, to share it with friends, colleagues, others in your network. I want to take this opportunity to thank several people without whom this report would have not been possible. First, Yaakov Malamet and Dr. Alex Pomson of Rostov Consulting for conducting the research, Jewish Federations of North America for partnering with us on this webinar, the Charles and Lynn Schusterman Family Philanthropies, whose support enabled us to commission this piece of research, and most importantly, the interviewees who gave of their time in the midst of being impacted by and involved in this crisis. I want to thank all of you who are here, and I know that many of you have been involved, whether by serving as a practitioner yourself on the ground, a volunteer, or raising much needed funds to enable these organizations and initiatives to do their work. Today's call will be an hour and 15 minutes. First, we're going to hear some personal reflections from a Ukrainian Jewish educator at Maisha House. Then we'll hear a summary of the findings from Rostov Consulting. Finally, we'll hear a response from Eric Fingerhut, the president and CEO of Jewish Federations of North America, who will share how federations are thinking about some of the things that are covered in this report. We will have time at the end for questions and answers. If you have questions, feel free to write them in the chat now. No need to wait for the end of this call. And so now it is my privilege to introduce our first speaker, Yulia Bezrikova, a Jewish educator for Russian-speaking Jewish communities at Maisha House. Yulia will share a bit of her personal story and work. I just recently met Yulia, but as a fellow Jewish educator, it was immediately clear that the Jewish educational world has a tremendous amount to learn from her. Maisha House was one of the interviewees in this research report. Yulia, if you can please share with us. Thank you.
Hello, thank you for such a warm welcome. I'm Yulia. I'm a Jewish educator for Russian-speaking Jewish communities outside of North America, working for Maisha House for a little bit more than a year. My main goal is to create a quality, meaningful Jewish programming in communities in Ukraine, Russia, Moldova, Germany, Israel, Australia, and many different other different countries. At the moment, I oversee 18 communities. Each of the communities have 3 Jewish leaders that are leading all the programs and communities of young adults that attend those programs. So I'm here today to tell my story because I feel in some way it is very representative of, it's one of the stories, one of the kinds of stories that are happening right now in the world. When war started, I was living in Kiev. To be more particular, 2 weeks before February 24th, which is considered the official start of the Russian invasion. It was very intense, and already in the media were a lot of news about like what to do in case of invasion, how to collect, how to stock food, what kind of food preserves for longer periods if you want to stay at home while military conflict. So even before the war, all those disturbing news started to come out. And for me and my husband, the breaking point in a way was when media started to share and ask, like embassies of European countries started to ask their citizens to immediately leave Ukraine within 48 hours. And it was very suspicious to us. Both of us have family in the western part of Ukraine, so we decided just to be more on the cautious side and go there for 2 weeks. And all of our friends thought that we are crazy. And just also to give some context, there are military actions between Ukraine and Russia in Ukraine from 2014, but it was all localized in the eastern part, only in one region. So for everyone, like all these news about Russia invading Ukraine, it's nothing new. It's something that was on agenda, and everyone has like immune response to it in a way already. So no one took it seriously this time as well. But as I know now for a fact, our decision to go to the western part really saved us and enabled us to move out from Ukraine, going to Europe on the second day of the war. All this time I was very much in touch with my supervisor, Yana, who was a part of this research as well. And Maisha House supported me in so many ways to make me safe, make my husband safe, to make sure that I can continue work in the capacity I can, because for sure, first few weeks, it was just a shock. And we went first to Budapest, then to Prague. We lived in Prague for 3 months. And there we decided that Canada would be a good final destination for us. Canadian government released a very nice program for Ukrainians who want to come to Canada right now. We did all our paperwork in months and a half, where before the war, the same paperwork could take up to 2 years. So they really quickly responded, and it helped us a lot. And now we are in Toronto and everything is good. At the same time, I can say that I feel very conflicted all the time, because my family is still in Ukraine, in Uzhhorod, western town, and my husband's family is there. My colleagues, our communities are there, and I continue to work with them. They continue to program, to create Shabbat dinners, to have Pesach Seder and everything. And if to put it like in a picture image that I always have in my head, that there is a famous painter, Frida Kahlo, and she has a very beautiful painting which is called Two Fridas, the Two Fridas. And I feel almost like that, holding my own hand, but being divided between very conflicted feelings, because from one hand, I'm happy to be in a safe place and experience living in a country with, to be honest, much higher quality of life than it was in Ukraine, economically and in many different ways. But at the same time, I worry about my family, about my friends. I worry about what will happen to Ukraine, and it's a constant struggle. So I try to pay attention to my mental health and continue to work as an educator, create resources. And I can say that lately, the majority of resources I create and conversation I have are all from the realm of what is Jewish wisdom, telling us how to feel our inner source, how to find hope in the darkness, how to continue to do tikkun olam and find strength to help each other. And if there is one message I really want to focus today and give you from me is the importance of Jewish community and community in general. I know that, as Diana said, so many communities, Jewish organizations responded very quickly and are helping not only to Jewish members of their communities, but to Ukrainian refugees and everyone in need. It's been an honor for me to be a part of that. And I also managed to volunteer a little bit here in Toronto, helping newcomers with the UJA Genesis organization. Still, there is a lot of work to do, and I'm sure that the report that we will hear today will be very valuable for us to not do things blindly, but really have a quality impact, support everyone who needs that, and continue this work, because there is a long way to go. But I'm sure that together we will be able to heal eventually from all the damage that is happening right now. Thank you.
Yulia, thank you for sharing your story and your work and reminding us something that we probably shouldn't need a reminder, but that the crisis is ongoing, is impacting people's lives in very real ways, and of the unbelievable resilience and strength of Ukrainians and people in the Ukrainian Jewish community and those that you are working with in Maisha House. So thank you. It is now my pleasure to welcome Yaakov Malamet of Rasav Consulting, who spearheaded this piece of research. It has been an absolute delight working with Yaakov and his colleagues. His thoughtfulness and generosity of spirit and just true partnership around this has been deeply moving to me. Yaakov will now share key findings from the research.
Thank you so much, Diana, and thanks, Julia, for sharing your story. And thank you very much to Olam for hosting this really important conversation. It's been a real a privilege for me as well in getting to engage in some of this really important work and to hear from some of these incredible people responding to the crisis on the ground in Ukraine and in the surrounding region. And Diana, I want to echo your thanks at the outset of our session for the interviewees, both for taking the time out of their really, really busy schedules to speak with us, and also for really the incredible work that they're leading on the ground and in communities around the world to support the people who are suffering the impact of this crisis. So as Diana mentioned in her introduction, this report that we conducted together is seeking to draw out some preliminary lessons from the Jewish and Israeli efforts that have mobilized in response to the crisis. And of course, the crisis remains ongoing and will likely continue to evolve over the coming months. We're seeking to provide some initial insights on how Jewish and Israeli groups have collaborated up until now, and perhaps some recommendations on how they can collaborate most effectively going forward. So from late April to early June 2022, we conducted 25 interviews with a sample of individuals representing international humanitarian aid organizations, umbrella organizations, Jewish engagement organizations, funders, Israeli government entities, and grassroots networks. You can see the list of the organizations we spoke to here on the slide, and you can also find them in the full report that was linked earlier in the chat. What we'll discuss today from the key findings of this report, some of the unique elements of the crisis response in Ukraine, the different levels of presence and preparedness that organizations had on the ground, as well as the different forms of response that they provided, some of the challenges and accomplishments listed by our interviewees, as well as some next steps and some lessons for the future of this crisis and other crises going forward. So for the unique elements of the crisis response in Ukraine, of course, Ukraine has been unique in humanitarian aid because of its unique geography, its location in Eastern and Central Europe. As a result of its location, organizations and volunteers could easily access response efforts on the ground in Ukraine from Europe and from Israel. Ukraine's existing infrastructure lowered logistical obstacles for transporting supplies to Ukraine, making that element of the response different than in other crises in the past. In the Jewish sphere, the well-developed network of existing Jewish communities in Ukraine really provided a foundation for other Jewish organizations from elsewhere in Europe, from Israel, and from the States to arrive and provide an unprecedented level of response. They had existing networks on the ground through the Ukrainian Jewish community that really supported early efforts of response. Of course, also in the Jewish and Israeli sphere, many Jewish and Israeli organizations felt the direct impact on the Ukrainian Jewish community through either their historical familial ties to communities in Ukraine, to ongoing program connections with contemporary Jewish communities in Ukraine, to friends and relatives and colleagues suffering the impact of the crisis. And so there was an intimate connection that prompted an unprecedented level of response here as well. Of course, the fact that the crisis in Ukraine took place in areas and territories that also experienced the Shoah 80 years ago was a significant point here as well. And the resonance of the Jewish history in this area was deeply felt by many of the people that we spoke to as well. For our interviewees that were coming from Central, Eastern, and Western Europe, they felt primarily also the direct geopolitical and social implications of the crisis. They were concerned about the crisis playing out on their doorstep and felt also that they had a motivation to respond because their own communities were beginning to see the impact of refugee resettlement, economic contraction, and the general upheaval caused by this crisis elsewhere in Europe as well. Of course, a unique element of this crisis that we heard from many people as well was this a perceived element of racism, a greater level of empathy towards white Western European refugees from Ukraine in contrast to other crises around the world. And of course, it's not to detract at all from the immense suffering that was taking place in Ukraine, but in asking the question, why was there this kind of response to this crisis, this was an element that came up amongst our interviewees as well. In terms of the various levels of presence on the ground in Ukraine before the crisis and preparedness to respond to the crisis, we'll discuss that now, as well as the different forms of response among the organizations and networks that we interviewed. So most of the organizations that we talked to have been present in Ukraine since the end of the Cold War or earlier, and many increased their presence in Ukraine following the initial crisis in 2014. This was a key finding because interviewees really mentioned that the organizations that had a deeper presence on the ground before the current crisis in February 22, those organizations were able to provide the earliest and most effective response on the ground. They had existing infrastructure, staff, and relationships that they could leverage very quickly to engage in critical response in those really important early days of the crisis. In terms of preparedness, on the other hand, most organizations were not fully prepared for the extent of the crisis that broke out at the end of February 22. They felt caught off guard, and although there was some speculation, as Julia mentioned, that there might be some escalation and there was some level of preparedness in the discourse, no one expected this level of crisis to emerge, especially this type of crisis that would encompass all of the territory of Ukraine beyond just the east. That being said, there were some international humanitarian aid organizations, primarily, that felt a little bit more prepared to respond to this crisis. Some of them had engaged in a more targeted monitoring of the crisis situation as early as December 2021. And this monitoring allowed them to develop some contingency plans, some emergency protocols, and to determine what steps they would take in case a crisis did emerge. Some organizations even stockpiled supplies, prepared evacuation plans, and prepared to launch fundraising campaigns in the weeks leading up to the invasion in February 2022. Interestingly, all of the organizations that we spoke to mentioned that they were building in their response on some level on lessons that they had learned in responding to the COVID pandemic. During the pandemic, organizations of all types began to collaborate in new ways to respond to that unique challenge. They organized on informal networks on WhatsApp groups and in Signal channels to provide response efforts to individuals in the early days of that pandemic crisis. And those practices became really essential in responding to the crisis in Ukraine as well. Most of the organizations that we interviewed in the Jewish and Israeli sphere tended to concentrate their response efforts on the border areas in Moldova and Poland. There were several reasons for this that you can check out in the longer form of the report. But one of the main reasons for this was the scaffolding amongst existing Jewish communities in these areas, that Jewish and Israeli organizations set up their foundation of response amongst existing Jewish communities in Poland and Moldova that served as an initial base for them when they arrived on the ground. All of the organizations that we spoke to engaged in some level of fundraising or grant making and distributing key grants in the early days of the crisis. Larger organizations were a little bit more likely to distribute funding to local partners to support their operations in those key moments, and specifically to those Jewish communities on the border of Poland and Moldova and Ukraine that were leading the effort to evacuate, accommodate, and resettle refugees. And these grants provided vital assistance to purchase supplies and support those operations in those first few days of the crisis. On the other hand, grassroots networks provided primarily cash grants to individuals, and these grants provided necessary funding for food, shelter, and medicine, as well as other assistance. And these networks, felt very comfortable facilitating direct grants to individuals because of the healthy trust and healthy connections that had built up in their networks before the crisis. So they didn't have the need to formally vet at least in the initial days, they could provide initial key needed response through the trust that was already inherent in the networks that they had built. The medical sphere played a key role here as well. Many organizations provided some form of medical response, from mobile clinics and delegations to providing various forms of medical supplies. The most visible example of this, of course, was the Israeli Civilian Field Hospital in Western Ukraine. Additionally, organizations of all sizes and types were involved in some elements of the journey of refugees, from evacuating individuals to facilitating their crossing of the border, to providing transportation, accommodation, and supplies along the way, and to eventually facilitating their integration into host communities in Europe and around the world. I will shift now to some of the challenges and the accomplishments that were mentioned by our interviewees in these first 3 months of the response. So, of course, one of the primary challenges here was the personal and emotional cost of the response amongst the people providing the response. They were really concerned about the safety of their relatives, their friends, and their colleagues who were living through the crisis. And they were working extra hours to provide as much assistance as they could, knowing that they had key impact and they wanted to invest as much time and energy as they could in providing that impact. On a more organizational level, we heard some frustration about the involvement of other organizations on the ground that might not have had the necessary elements or the right skills to answer the needs that existed, and therefore were providing subpar response, or even in some cases taking advantage of the crisis to promote themselves or their organizations. Similarly, we heard about a challenge of managing unqualified volunteers in the eyes of the interviewees that drew energy and time of people showing up on the ground lacking the necessary language or professional skills to provide serious long-term care for refugees. Similarly, organizationally, a lot of the organizations that we spoke to were managing competing commitments to responding to other crises around the world, as well as ongoing program commitments, routine program commitments, and are still managing the challenge of providing effective response in Ukraine, as well as maintaining the mission of their organization since before the crisis. Of course, and one of the biggest challenges that was, I think we mentioned briefly already, is maintaining public attention and fundraising as the crisis transforms and as it shifts from the front page. This is especially challenging for the organizations we spoke to as the war shifts into its new stages and the attention continues to fade. The challenge to maintain that attention, the awareness, and the fundraising it remains critical. With all of these challenges, there were some significant accomplishments in the response to Ukraine as well, to the crisis in Ukraine as well. All of the interviewees reported exceptional partnership and collaboration, both between various organizations of different sizes, religious denominations, backgrounds, and nationalities, and also between organizations and grassroots networks. This was particularly the case in guiding the journey of refugees, where one organization might provide the transportation for one leg of the refugees' journey, and another organization might coordinate to provide supplies and food throughout that journey, and then another organization might facilitate the transfer of that person's journey over the border, and so on. Several interviewees did highlight that in the beginning of the crisis, especially a crisis of this magnitude and one that was occurring in the context of an active conflict, there was a certain amount of duplication early in the crisis, but that coordination really, since those early days, coordination really increased over time, and they were really heartened and impressed by the ability of many organizations of different types and sizes to work together to provide effective response. On a lower level here, the organizations were also proud of the fact that they had expanded their operations beyond their normal sphere of operations to provide effective response. And this was particularly true for Jewish engagement organizations that pivoted towards providing disaster relief in ways that they haven't in the past. For grassroots networks, this was also the case, and they were also they had also accomplished the effort to remain connected and active and maintain those relationships even while many of the members had dispersed throughout Europe and throughout communities in the world when they might have been members of the same community locally in Ukraine. And maybe most importantly, the biggest sense of accomplishment that we heard from interviewees was their response, the moments in the crisis where they had direct contact with a specific person, where they could say that their specific intervention, their connection of a person to a bus that was leaving a city or to supplies that were arriving in a certain location, that intervention had a direct impact on someone's life and someone's ability to move through the next phases of this crisis. So now just briefly to talk about some next steps recommendations that we heard from our interviewees. Interviewees mentioned the need to cultivate flexibility as the situation, as we mentioned, continues to change, and the response needs on the ground continue to change accordingly. Early in the crisis, for example, the focus was on refugees and on the border, and now the focus has shifted more towards integration, resettlement, and increasingly also rebuilding various areas in Ukraine. And so the response, according to the interviewees, needs to shift accordingly to manage those needs as they change. A second recommendation was to formalize information in the ecosystem of organizations responding to the crisis, to provide clearer definition of response roles, to perhaps create a formal convening of the field so that there could be a more in-depth and direct sharing of specific lessons learned in the crisis, and perhaps also a conversation led by funders to determine priorities for rebuilding as the crisis moves into its next phase in Ukraine. The third recommendation here that we've mentioned briefly is also the need to maintain funding and maintain awareness. The interviewees recommended efforts to coordinate maintaining awareness within the Jewish and Israeli communities, and perhaps even a shared platform for continuing to fundraise to support future response and rebuilding efforts in Ukraine. A similar recommendation here was to continue to keep a finger on the pulse and to maintain a sense of how the response has developed over the last 6 months and over the first 12 months of the crisis and longer, and to provide an understanding to the field of which responses prove most effective in real time, and perhaps also to provide information for possible directions of future responses in Ukraine as the crisis continues to evolve over the next coming months. A critical next step here also was focusing on Russian-speaking Jewish communities. And then, although of course the crisis has primarily affected Ukraine and Ukrainian Jewish communities in Russia, Belarus, and elsewhere have begun to suffer impacts of this crisis as well. And we saw an element of this in the last couple of weeks with the Jewish agency's shifting position in Russia. The crisis has also shifted prior ways of working with Jewish communities in the former Soviet Union. If before the crisis, many organizations integrated their Russian-speaking programs and networks between Ukraine and Russia, those networks, infrastructure, and relationships are no longer as available. And so there's a need for new strategies for Jewish engagement work in the former Soviet Union, and perhaps even a need for independent Ukrainian Jewish infrastructure. Lastly, on this point, the crisis has impacted funding for engagement work in Russian-speaking Jewish communities. And so there's a need now to find new, more sustainable sources of funding for this work. More broadly, the interviewees also provided some lessons for future crises, as well as the ongoing crisis in Ukraine. The first of these was to predetermine response roles in the crisis, both internally within various organizations and also as a field, to determine what resources an organization might have available in the event of a crisis, where they might be best positioned to offer the most effective response, and what role they could play in the ecosystem of response if a crisis were to emerge. A second recommendation here was maintaining financial sustainability and emergency funding. So both internally, that organizations should maintain emergency funding dedicated for crisis response, so that in the event of a crisis, they're not preoccupied with fundraising while they're providing the initial response in those critical early days. And additionally, that the ecosystem could maintain a dedicated disaster fund that would be set aside and available to organizations at the moment that they need it most. A third recommendation here was to integrate the responses between organizations and responses from grassroots networks. There were so many positive examples in the early days of Ukraine of these two forms of responses coming together. And interviewees recommended formalizing this process so that organizations could provide economic and professional infrastructure for grassroots networks, that there could institute channels to communicate knowledge from the ground, from grassroots networks dispersed in various communities, engaged in the work, to organizations, providing a higher level view in both directions. And also to a formula for transitioning or handing off the response efforts from the local grassroots networks that respond early in the crisis to long-term, larger scale, better funded organizational responses in the next phase. And partially as an element of this, to invest in local networks as an element of the response. That these networks were often the earliest responders and the most effective responders in the first days. And so in routine, there should be an emphasis on providing skills in recruiting volunteers, skills in community management, support for maintaining relationships in grassroots networks, and continuing to build trust over time so that these networks can remain healthy, can thrive, and in the unfortunate event of a crisis, can serve as key elements in providing response. Thank you very much to Olam and to Diana and to Julia. Thank you.
Thank you, Jaco, for sharing those findings. As I mentioned earlier in the call, we will have a chance for questions and answers a little bit later. No need to wait to share those questions now. So if you have questions either for Julia or for Jaco or myself, please feel free to enter them in the chat. It is now my pleasure to introduce Eric Fingerhut, the President and CEO of Jewish Federations of North America. Eric's personal leadership and organizational leadership in this crisis has been nothing short of outstanding, not just on the philanthropic level, but also what people may be less aware of is serving a catalytic role to foster collaboration among some of the organizations that were featured in this study, particularly around a shared volunteer hub for skilled volunteers, and really setting an example for what it looks like to partner in a time of crisis. And so it is my pleasure to introduce Eric, who will share some thoughts with us emerging from this report and insights in terms of how JFNA is now viewing its response to this crisis. Thank you, Eric.
Thank you, Diana. It's so what a pleasure to be with you. Thanks for your work and for commissioning this study. Thanks to the excellent presentation, Yaakov, and the excellent research. It's very, very valuable. I only have a few minutes, so I'm going to jump right in. I want to say that a couple of the findings that you've just shared, Yaakov, really validate the way we reinforce the way we think about this work across the 146 Jewish federations that comprise the Jewish Federations of North America. The first is that and really two of the, I should say, a finding and a recommendation really dovetail together that I want to highlight from your report. The first is you found, one of your findings was that the experienced organizations, those that have been on the ground longer, were better able to respond quickly with excellence to the crisis. Of course, in some ways that's intuitive, but it's nevertheless important to lift up. You also highlighted in your recommendations that organizations are asking for routine sustainability so that they can be on the ground, as well as emergency funding when the emergency hits. And so I just want to share, for those who don't know, that the Jewish Federation System has for decades maintained an annual funding partnership with at least 2 or 3 of the largest relief organizations, the Jewish Agency for Israel, the Joint, JDC, that were on the ground here, and World Org that works in the education sphere. But the 2 largest by far of our annual commitments are to the Joint and to the Jewish Agency. And just to give you some sense of the magnitude, we're talking about over $100 million per year. So the fact that you had experienced professionals on the ground who knew their communities and knew how to do this work and had the relationships to activate quickly was the result of the annual funding. The emergency funding, which now totals over $70 million that we've raised, is what you see in the extra buses and the extra hotels and the extra refugee centers and the added cost of security and medicines, all the things that we know were elevated. But it's really important to appreciate that when you were at the border and you saw the buses coming towards the border and you saw these extraordinary professionals sacrificing really putting themselves at risk, what you were seeing was the result of that annual sustainable funding that we're so proud of, and it leads into one other of your findings, which is the concern about are we going to be able to keep up the fundraising as this crisis clearly is going to go on for a while and could potentially, God forbid, become even worse in some of the parts of the country. And there again, the experience of having an organization like ours partnering with key partners year after year after year means that we have a system of communicating analyzing and communicating the ongoing needs. And we, of course, look to be able to expand that ongoing relationship. So thank you for those findings and recommendations, which, again, I think sort of make us feel somewhat validated in this long-term approach. When you do something year in and year out for decades, it's easy for people to say, why are we still giving the same to the same organizations? Why are we still doing this? There's all these new good causes out there, right? And of course, the answer is, UJ Federation of New York used to say we were there on 9/11 because we were there on 9/10. My favorite cliche is you don't build a fire department when the house is on fire. You build the fire department to be able to put out the fire when it comes. And so we're in the business of building fire departments, not just racing to an emergency. I want to just, if I have just one more minute, Deanna, I probably overstayed my welcome already, but add one or two other just very quick thoughts. It was very clear in this emergency that and this is in your findings, Jacob, that our core partners were essential, and we're so proud of them, that there were many, many organizations that were doing essential, vital work on the ground. And so we're proud that we were able to, from the about $70 million that's been raised so far in emergency funding, to fund 38 different organizations and to create what we hope was a very simple process. Talk to us. We'll get the facts. You don't need to write a big proposal, and we're not going to require extensive reports. Obviously, we have auditing we have to do, but we're really proud of that, and I think we've opened a lot of new relationships that we hope will continue and extend into the future. And so a lesson for us has been to try to be as open as we can be. Not just to commit to our historical partners, but to invite others to share with us what they're doing. And I know that's true of many other funders. The foundations have been open to organizations that they've never, that they didn't know about. And everybody created a streamlined process to move money quickly without added burden on the ground. The last point I want to make is with regard to the issue of Jewish relief versus broader non-sectarian relief. And there's only a couple things necessary to be said. One is that, of course, Jews help Jews. This is an unbreakable, fundamental obligation that we will not ever allow to go unfilled. But Jews also help the world, and we are in a position, thank God, to be able to provide broader assistance. Our Jewish relief organizations, as we all know, have been, and I believe, Yaakov, you mentioned, have been helping anyone who shows up. But let's also be very, honest that they are especially geared. You mentioned they're located in Jewish communities. They put themselves in the positions where they could serve the Jewish community. That's their job. Of course, anybody who shows up gets help, but they were primarily there. And of course, if they were trying to serve the whole population, they couldn't do it because even our largest, most substantial organizations couldn't possibly reach everybody. The second thing that is to be said is, of course, the broader humanity, the Jewish community's needs, which are massive, are just a small piece of this, of what is really the largest global humanitarian crisis, as we've read many times in Europe, since World War II. No way the Jewish people alone can solve that humanitarian crisis. It's the work of governments and many others. But we can make a meaningful contribution, both because of the resources that we're blessed to be able to generate, and because of the skill sets, our technical skills, our medical skills, and a variety of other opportunities. So we are committed both to maintaining the leadership that is needed of the Jewish community to make sure all Jews are served, as long as this crisis goes on, and it will be clearly for years, but also to working with all of the generous folks in the Jewish community and partners across the humanitarian relief landscape, both Jewish and non-Jewish, to make the most meaningful contribution we can to the broader the broader humanitarian effort, without thinking we're going to solve it, but believing that we can make a difference, and we will provide as much leadership together with so many other wonderful Jewish leaders that are doing this work on the broader humanitarian effort as well.
Eric, thank you so much for joining us and for sharing those remarks, and to JFNA for partnering with us on this webinar and for the work that you're doing in this crisis. I want to encourage people to share questions in the chat for any of our speakers. And as you are doing that, I'll just share a couple of personal reflections in terms of this research. So the first is that anecdotally early in the crisis, I was hearing stories of collaboration, but I was super curious as to what individuals and organizations would say under the cloak of anonymity and behind closed doors. And as Yaakov will attest, I even asked him and his colleagues, so did people say, don't quote me on this, but, and the answer was no. The answer was that there really was collaboration across the board, and I think the Jewish community can be very proud. When I first came into this role in Olam 7 years ago, I did not come from a background in humanitarian aid, and one of the things that I heard time and again was collaboration is most difficult in times of crisis, because you need to act quickly, because lots of money is coming in, because people are competing for attention, etc. And I think the fact that the Jewish ecosystem, the wide variety of organizations and Jewish-led groups that were part of this effort, found ways to collaborate is something that should make us proud, and that makes me proud. That's the first. And then the second is, we talked a lot about collaboration, and here at Olam, we try to walk the walk and talk the talk. And so early in the crisis, we partnered with 2 other umbrella organizations that work in the spheres of Jewish and Israeli international development and humanitarian aid. So the Jewish Coalition for Disaster Relief, which is housed at JDC, and the Society for International Development Israel. And together we mapped the Jewish and Israeli response. As I mentioned earlier in this call, we see this research not just as something that we're going to put on the shelf, but the concrete recommendations around this crisis and around other crises. We see this as a tool and a catalyst for conversations, interventions, and partnerships moving forward. And at Olam, we are committed to doing that in partnership with other entities who have overlapping networks or other networks to us. And so one thing that I will share in the chat, and then go to some questions, is if you are interested in being part of some of those convenings and conversations that we are going to hold in the coming weeks and months, both those that are related to this specific crisis, as well as other humanitarian crises around the world, you can fill in this brief form, and we will be sure to invite you to the relevant conversations that are going to be Tachlis oriented, trying to figure out how we work together to meeting some of the recommendations and beyond. So we'll include that in the chat. I see a question here. It says, how do we start taking next steps in light of these findings to ensure even more effective collaboration? I'm going to direct that to Eric.
Thanks, Diana. Well, first of all, I think this research is a great first step, and the convenings you've just described, and we will partner with you on that, completely. I think the collaboration is real, and it's not just at the it was evident on the ground. Anybody should see. I mean, it was beautiful to see on the ground, but it is evident in the sort of C-suites, if you will, too, that we talk to each other a lot. So I think that I think that we need to pursue the convenings, Diana, that you've suggested, and we're prepared to work with you on those to implement those recommendations. As I said, I really think that the case for ongoing sustainability of we call it a global 911 system. When we talk to donors in our annual campaigns, we say with all sincerity that when you donate to your local federation, in addition to helping local needs, you are able to reach any Jew anywhere in the world instantly that needs help because of our global partners that we support on an ongoing basis. And I'd like to think that we could build that mentality collaboratively together across the whole Jewish ecosystem.
Right. The next question, how do we leverage the interest the Jewish community has in this crisis to garner interest in other less cash-rich crises? I think maybe I'll field that, and if any of our other speakers want to take that as well. I have spoken over the last several weeks about using this as a bridge to empathy, and people have challenged me on that. But I do think that this crisis, in many ways, was unique, given the multiple Jewish touch points, both historically and currently. But it has raised awareness in the Jewish community and the world at large to the plight of forcibly displaced people and refugees, reminded us that that is part of our own story, whether in the far distant past or in the present or somewhere in between. And I do think that there is a possibility to simultaneously say we are not going to stop meeting the needs of this crisis, and we can open up our hearts to be thinking about the plights of refugees elsewhere. So my hope is that it can be a bridge to empathy. I think that that's actually a challenge to organizations like Olam and some of our partners to do that educational work to help connect the dots. But that is something that has been on my mind and I've been thinking about a lot. The next question, and I think this is directed primarily to Yaakov, is, were there any sort of noteworthy differences between the Israeli and American Jewish / diaspora Jewish organizations and groups responding?
Sure. Thanks for the question. It's a very interesting one that we explored a lot. It's from the interviewees, we heard that there was primarily differences on maybe the expected cultural differences between Israeli organizations and American or other diaspora Jewish organizations, meaning that on the ground, we heard from organizations operating on the ground that Israeli organizations were perhaps a little bit more willing to go into a certain area, take the initiative, lead response from the ground itself, and American organizations, diaspora Jewish organizations, tended to have more systems in place, have also more funding in place, and operate a little bit more systematically in terms of mapping needs, understanding what the needs might be, and then trying to engage a response that would meet a specific need. And we heard from more or less all of our interviewees that each one of these directions of response is critical in the crisis. That both of these approaches were necessary to have people who would go in, show up, and say, "Here are the skills that I have to offer. I speak Russian. I speak Ukrainian. I have medical training. I'm coming from Israel, and I can offer a response." And the other approach of the American organizations, primarily, that said, we want to operate with our local existing partners. We're going to conduct the mapping of the needs, and we're going to provide the resources to meet those needs.
I'm going to ask one final question. This one is to you, Leah. I am curious, from your eyes as someone who is Ukrainian, what resonated in the report, meaning what reinforced your own experiences? What would you want to challenge in the report? Was there anything that surprised you? What was your take on the report?
Thank you. What really resonated with me is how it really reflected my experience and what I see in our communities in Ukraine right now. Moshe House has 4 houses in Ukraine, and we have our Jewish leaders, and the fact that a lot of financial support and humanitarian support was based just on our trust to them, and they're being an incredible leaders. And some of our alumni created grassroots organizations to help others. And I think Jewish professionals and people who are very active involved in their Jewish communities, they do have like a very special skill set and also a very special mindset. Because being a Jewish educator, I will tell a little bit about Jewish education. We focus a lot in Ukrainian Russian communities on struggles of immigrants, the topic of home, what is Jewish identity, how we help each other feel more at ease with our Jewish identity, because historically it was suppressed for a very long time, and now we are looking for new ways how to reestablish it. And I think this crisis really allowed us to look at all of those topics from different angles. And the majority of our activists, that I call them right now, are saying that was not even a question if they will take part in some volunteer initiative or not. Those who decided to stay in Ukraine, they are all very, very actively involved in helping everyone around, primarily Jewish community, but also non-Jews who need that. And this really gives me a lot of hope. But yeah, and another point I wanted to stress from the report as well, about the organizations that took advantage of some of the funding. And I hope I will not bring a lot of blame on myself right now, but we have to all understand that Ukraine is not the most developed economically, and it's a country with a lot of corruption, and it's not a secret. I love Ukraine. I wish this war would end tomorrow, but still, I think the path of trusting our community members and people who have certain skill sets is the safest to continue this important task to help people in Ukraine.
Thank you. We have another question in the chat that about whether organizations have been able to leverage from funds, from various governments, Ukraine or neighbors. Philanthropy cannot fund all the future need. This was outside of the scope of this particular study. I will say that this webinar is in the context of Olam's annual Focal Point Fest gathering, which includes virtual sessions and also in-person events in 7 different cities around the world. And at our London event earlier this week, this was actually one of the key questions that was explored. And for anyone who is interested, I would welcome emails to Olam, and we're happy to share some of the findings from that conversation that happened related to government versus philanthropy in this crisis. I want to thank all of our speakers here today, Yulia, Yakov, and Eric, both for being on this webinar, but more importantly for the work that you do and for the learnings that you've provided for the field. The report, the link is in the chat. It is now also on Olam's website. You can access it in this regard. I want to encourage anyone here who would like to use this report as a tool for conversations with their own teams, volunteers, etc., to please be in touch with us. We're happy to support you in any way possible in that regard. And if you are indeed interested in being part of conversations related to how we translate some of those recommendations into concrete reality, please reach out to us as well. I'll also just take this opportunity to say that Focal Point is still ongoing. And if you are in this session, it means that you are registered. You can access other sessions tomorrow, and I'll highlight one of them that is for staff members of our partner organizations and individual members. It is a fireside chat with the president and CEO of UNICEF USA that is being moderated by an individual member of ours who is a consultant both for IsraAid and for Global. That is taking place at 10 a.m. tomorrow morning. We look forward to seeing you tomorrow, and also to continuing to being in touch related to this crisis and beyond. Thank you very much.